Okay, so thank you everybody for joining today. My name is Becky O'Connor. I'm a farm to school coordinator with Cornell Cooperative Extension's statewide farm to school coordinator team. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen okay? Nod or a thumbs up from somebody. Okay, great. So again, thanks for joining for this Buying Local Beef and More for Schools webinar. Like I said, my name is Becky O'Connor. I'm with our statewide farm to school coordinator team through Cornell Cooperative Extension's Harvest New York program. So the focus of our team is really on increasing the volume and variety of local foods procured and served by schools and by any institutions. But right now we really work in the K through 12 market. So we do this by providing direct support to supply chain partners, providing statewide support via resource development, training, and technical assistance to supply chain partners, and by strengthening campus to community connections by identifying and developing opportunities for applied local food systems research. So I myself am in Western New York, and I cover about 12 counties in Western New York, and then moving into the Finger Lakes. We have Lizzie Cooper in Central New York, Megan Doman in the North Country, Katie Sheehan Lopez in the Upper Hudson Valley, Christy Apostolides in the Lower Hudson Valley, S.J. Whelan in New York City, and Amy Bly in Long Island. And I believe we have both Katie and Amy on today. So if you ever have, and I'm sorry, Cheryl Belinsky is our program lead, so she also provides statewide support as well. So following this webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or any of our farm to school coordinators or to Cheryl, and we are happy to help you because this is a lot of new information for schools. So today I'm going to do a little introduction, and then we will hear from New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets on the food safety aspects of buying local beef and other foods for schools. And then Amy Barkley from the CC Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team is going to talk to us about the actual process of buying local beef and how you can do that. So why are we here today? Why are we doing this webinar? There have been increased opportunities and interest in purchasing local beef and animal proteins because of farm to school. So this is due in part to the 30% New York initiative, Local Foods for Schools funding, as well as the supply chain disruptions we saw during COVID and increased awareness of local food systems. Buying a whole or a part of a cow is the most affordable way to purchase local beef. But as of now, I'm not familiar with any schools that are doing that. I do work with 2 districts that were going to do that. And then I said, wait, is this cow processed in a USDA facility? And it wasn't. So that's the kind of thing that, schools might not know about. You need to make sure it's processed in a USDA facility. So I want schools to be able to walk away, and we all want schools to be able to walk away, food service directors from this webinar with the knowledge and the confidence to work with farmers and processors to purchase local beef. We certainly don't expect you to go out there and do it on your own if you don't want to. And we farm school coordinators are happy to help. So first off, we're going to hear from Thomas Collaro. I hope I'm saying that right, from USDA. So you can go ahead and please just let me know when to advance to the next slide.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Thomas Collaro. I'm the Deputy Regional Director in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm with the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, and then you see my Office of Investigation, Enforcement, and Audit, and the Compliance and Investigations Division. Sorry. It's any government agency. It's always a mouthful, all the acronyms and offices we work in. Next slide, please. So I was going to give you a quick background on the USDA and kind of our role and responsibilities as it applies to meat and poultry products. And then we'll go over quickly what the mark of inspection means. And I have some photographs of what you could be looking for on a package of meat. So the Food Safety Inspection Service is a public health agency within the USDA, and we're responsible for ensuring that the nation's commercial supply of meat, poultry, and egg products, both domestic and imported, is safe, wholesome, correctly labeled, and packaged. It's pretty much that simple. And we do that through the authorities spelled out in the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, and the Egg Product Inspection Act. And we do humane handling under Humane Methods in Slaughtering Act. Next slide, please. All right, so just a quick background on the National School Lunch Program, and this may be a little bit of a surprise, even though this is your guys' area of expertise in your field. So USDA's Food and Nutrition Service, their regulatory and statutory authority for the school meals program are found in Section 9 of the Richard B. Russell National School Lunch Act. And you see the regulatory citation on your slide there. Obviously that may not be the only federal law that or state law that applies or local law regulation that applies to schools. And you see the bullet points here. Schools must obtain at least 2 food safety inspections each school year, and school food authorities must develop a written food safety plan for the food preparation and service. And that's typically done by HACCP principles, which is a hazard analysis critical control point. Now you may be saying, I don't remember even having one, and that's not uncommon. I don't know any school that's had 2 in a year. You might go 5-10 years without seeing someone from the federal government in your facility. Again, not uncommon, nothing to get worried about. It's just giving you a quick background. Next slide, please. All right, so our mark of inspection. So as I said, we're responsible for inspecting meat, poultry, and egg products. Our inspection program personnel, or IPP, they're present at all times in every slaughter facility in the country while they're slaughtering and processing animals, whether that's cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, turkeys, what have you. And they're in facilities that further process products, your hot dogs, your roast beef, your chicken pies, things like that. Each and every day, they'll pop in and out, maybe an hour here and 2 hours there, what have you. They're not there all day like they are in the slaughter facilities. So the federal inspection assures the consumer that the meat, poultry, and egg products are clean, safe, and wholesome for human consumption at the time of purchase. Pretty simple. So what that means, it involves antemortem inspection of the live animal, postmortem inspection of the carcass and internal organs, and inspection of the facilities, equipment, personnel, transportation, and we look at records, right? So we look at the animal alive, we look at the animal after it's been slaughtered and processed, and we look at the facilities as a whole to make sure that everything's being processed in an appropriate manner. Next slide, please. So in a red meat or poultry slaughter establishment, the inspection process starts with receiving the live animal, right? And that's what we call antemortem inspection. It involves a visual and physical evaluation of the live animal prior to slaughter, and it's to identify any conditions that may indicate disease or illness. Typically you'll observe an animal at rest, and then they'll have the animal walk. So you observe each side of the animal going one way and then coming back. So you see both sides of the animal, make sure their gait is appropriate, they're not off balance, things like that, which may indicate disease. And then post-mortem inspections allows inspection personnel to further evaluate the health and carcass and parts. And they're looking at everything: heart, liver, lungs, the intestines of the animal, looking at the carcass, just making sure there's no cancer or anything crazy like that in the animal. And then the inspection system continues throughout the further processing until the finished package is shipped, right? So if they're cutting into ground beef or steaks, we're on site and making sure that it's in a clean environment, that the temperature is being maintained as appropriate. There's some regulations that call for testing for ground beef or trim for E. coli, salmonella, things like that. So IPP are responsible for verifying that establishment is maintaining sanitary conditions and implementing and maintaining all food safety related procedures and labeling regulations. So the product should be labeled appropriately as it comes out of the facility, whether it's allergens and things like that. So you're assured, the consumer is assured that that product at the grocery store is wholesome and is labeled appropriately. Next slide, please. So this is the market inspection. You see an example on the bottom right here, and that's what you should see on your package of meat, whether it's the ground beef. If you're buying, say, I don't think any school would buy, but just in case a whole carcass or half or a quarter or something like that, you see that actually stamped on the meat. But if you're just buying a package and you're buying, say, ground beef that you're going to make whatever you're going to make, you should see that little mark inspection on the actual package. The meat and poultry production is the most highly regulated food industry. It's been that way for 100 years. Again, FSAS is responsible for providing regulatory oversight during the day-to-day production of red meat and poultry products. And we do this to ensure that each federally inspected establishment is operated and maintained in a manner sufficient to prevent the creation of unsanitary conditions and to ensure that the product is not adulterated. The next slide. And this is where you all would come in as consumers of these products, as schools are buying product or local, what have you. I know there's a lot of questions, and this is all containers of meat, poultry, and egg products must be labeled with the USDA mark of inspection and establishment number. Each establishment number is unique and it goes back to a certain establishment. So if there's any issues or any recall, you can identify it right away that it was produced at this establishment. The establishment number may appear on the package within the USDA mark of inspection, as we saw on the previous slide. It may also appear elsewhere on the exterior of the package container or on the label. An example may be on the lid of a can, or it may be the mark of inspection should be on the package of the meat, but you may see the actual establishment number ink jetted across the top, something like that. So you may have to look at it, but it should say like EST, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you know where it came from. Next slide. So if you see this, and Becky touched on this earlier, that a couple schools were looking to buy ground beef and found out that the facility wasn't USDA inspected. We call that custom. They operate on a custom exemption, and there's a number of exemptions which would take literally all day to explain. But if you see this on a package, ground beef, not for sale. Each package that's produced at a custom facility is required to stamp their packages not for sale, meaning it's not for sale to someone else, right? They're buying a live animal, they're paying for the process of that animal to be slaughtered and processed, and the resulting product cannot be sold, right? It's just for that individual or their family. So if you see this, that's, take it literally, it's not for sale. Next slide. And that's it. And I don't know, Becky, if you're gonna push out the slides, but in the notes section of the slide, there's a link to our webpage. It's pretty interactive, but you can go in New York and see all the slaughter establishments within New York that are USDA inspected and what they do. And it actually shows you in a map where they are. So if you're in the North Country, you can see exactly where it is. If you're out, by the Finger Lakes by you, Becky, you can see, all right, what's in that area where maybe I can contact that USDA producer, let them know like, hey, this is what I want to do. I want to make sure that you are USDA inspected and that the animal is going to be processed under USDA inspection. And that way you can be assured that the product is safe, wholesome, and you can provide it to your schools. And that's it. I know we didn't have a lot of time, because I just want to throw a couple slides together for everyone. Little background.
Yeah, so I
Thank
just dropped that link in the chat there. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, you can always feel free to reach out afterwards with any questions.
Yeah, I'm always available.
Yeah. And Angela, was anybody from Ag and Markets going to talk?
Yeah, I have Sharon and Corey on here.
Great. Great. So we will pass it over to Ag and Markets now.
Okay. So Corey, would you like me to just briefly go over some of the things that we regulate here at Agriculture and Markets, or do you want to jump in with poultry?
You're on mute.
Okay,
You're on mute.
you're muted, so I'm going to go ahead and take that as a cue to go ahead. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharon Fertel. I'm the Chief Food Inspector for Region 1, New York State Agriculture and Markets. Our regions are separated by 3 areas: the upstate area, which is Westchester, all the way to the Canadian border. And that is the area that I cover. And then, of course, 2 other regions down in this city. And we won't talk about them. So I am going to talk today about some of the things that we regulate. And Becky, if you don't mind, I'm going to share with you this document and you can put this up on the screen. Okay. We should be getting that shortly. So I'm going to mostly go over what Agriculture and Markets does. You can share this form. I'd appreciate that because it also lists all the other agencies in New York State and the agencies under Agriculture and Markets. So I'll briefly go over those. So I'll just start with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. We inspect food processing facilities, and I'm going to go through a list of those from the gamut of wholesale distribution, such as frozen food manufacturers, fruit and vegetable processing, both raw and or processed, bakeries, and that's wholesale bakeries. Retail bakeries are inspected by the Department of Health, DOH. Spices, commodities, packaged and or repackaged, beverage manufacturers, either soda, juice, apple cider, drinks, food ingredients such as sugar, flour, oil, salts, etc. We do nut manufacturers, both processed, repackaging, and packaged, confectionery, candies, chocolate, gum, and seafood and fish products, packaged and or processed. Just a quick note, USDA does catfish. Thomas, you might want to talk about that one. It's an interesting conundrum there. We do baby food. We do ice manufacturers, multiple ingredient maple syrup and honey manufacturers. So just to clarify that, if a processor has the honey and they produce the honey, well, they don't produce the honey, but they tap the honey and the syrup, and they don't have an added value, that is not in fact licensed. But if they add some added value to that product, then it is licensed under R20C. Again, we have farm products such as produce, pickles, salsa, further processed eggs, repackaged foods from bulk containers, convenience store food manufacturing, prepackaged sandwiches, wraps, salads, etc. And just for clarification on the sandwiches, we do what is called a closed face sandwich where you really can't see the meat. USDA does the open face sandwiches where you can see the meat. And another interesting one maybe Thomas might talk about. We also do dry good manufacturers such as cereal bars, pasta, rice. So again, we do quite a lot from the gamut of your basic bodega store doing processing to a baby food manufacturer like Beech-Nut, which we have in the state. The chart that I have and have shared with you, Becky, if you share it with the rest of the group, goes over some of the other state agencies and their responsibilities. Angela, if you want, we can hit on those too. Would you like to?
Yeah, I was just asking Becky if she wanted me to share. There we go. If she wanted me to share my screen, I have it opened. Okay. So we just have, I don't think you touched upon the fact that in the Department of Agriculture, we have other divisions, and we have the Milk and Dairy Services within the division, the Department of Agriculture. So they're responsible for the wholesale manufacturing inspection of dairy products. So milk, butter, yogurt, things like that. Grade A products, which is milk, and I'm not a specialist in dairy, but I think it's milk and butter. I actually don't know if yogurt is considered a grade A product, but they have their own inspection. So the whole key of this portion of our conversation today is to ensure that food is being procured from an approved source. So with all of the items that Sharon mentioned, Article 20C food processing license is required to manufacture those foods. But then on the dairy end, if it's a wholesale manufacturer, there's also a dairy permit that is required. So just to, I know this is a kind of a talk about meat products today, but just to keep in the back of your mind that if you do intend to purchase items that are dairy, they also need to have a dairy permit. Then the other portion of this document explains about the role of the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation. I don't imagine that a school is purchasing live shellfish for sale and to send to the children. I don't think, but I don't know. You may have a special day where you provide this type of food. So again, just to ensure that everyone is aware that the Department of Agriculture does not have jurisdiction over the harvesting of fish, anything that's live, quite honestly. So if someone is fishing, we do not have the jurisdiction over that. We do have the jurisdiction once that fish is on land and then it becomes processed. So the idea is to make sure that someone has a DEC permit to fish for what they're fishing for, and then the 20C food processing license to process what that fish is. The other portion on here, so Sharon mentioned that we have jurisdiction over food manufacturing. Well, there's food service, and which would be cafes and restaurants, takeout foods, catering facilities, commissaries. Those items are inspected by the Department of Health. So whether it may be the local health department that's in a particular county, or if that county does not have a local health department where the state Department of Health has the jurisdiction, then they will in fact inspect those facilities. So we created this document so this can be shared. And Cheryl, I see you're on the line. This is the document. I was literally about to pass it out to you today. So feel free to share away. And there are some exemptions on the bottom, right in the center under the dairy portion of it, that says some of these things are exempt from licensing and or inspection. When it comes to schools, there are other exemptions like alcohol exemptions. I removed that from this document for the purposes of schools. So honey producers and maple syrup producers, they are exempt from licensing and from inspection. Home processors, again, I don't know if schools want to purchase local, there's nothing saying that you cannot purchase from a home processor. Just be aware, home processors must be registered with New York State Department of Agriculture and Markets. They do get a document back saying they are in fact registered, and there is a limitation as to what they can manufacture at home. So it's typically a non-potentially hazardous type of a product, like cookies and bread, things like that, that don't require any special processing or any special or any refrigeration or freezing, as a matter of fact. So those are the exemptions. And if you scroll up a hair, there are a couple of flow charts on the bottom, to the bottom of the document. Yeah. We try to put these flow charts to explain that if you want to engage in a New York grower, which is what we're talking about today. So New York grower or a manufacturer of any of these products on your menu, then obviously you just need to ensure that the facility is licensed, inspected, and it's coming from an approved source, which would be something from USDA. So it's an approved source, or a product coming from a produce farm in New York State, that's inspected, or it's coming from a food manufacturer within New York State. So you just have to ask them make sure that they are a legitimate approved source. I can't speak to this poultry stuff because it's way beyond me. So maybe Corey can pipe in and talk about some of the poultry information.
Sure. Good afternoon. So just following up where Tom had left off, we have an Article 5A slaughterhouse license in New York State. So what that allows for slaughterhouses to do is to slaughter and process amenable poultry species and non-amenable poultry and red meat species. So when I say that, what that means is, Tom was talking about animals that come in for federal inspection. So when it comes to New York State, we do not license or oversee or have jurisdiction over the slaughter of red meat animals. That's your cattle, goat, sheep, lambs, pigs. They must be federally inspected to come into commerce. When it comes to poultry, USDA does provide exemptions for state establishments to operate, and those exemptions have certain preclusions, but essentially what happens is this. Our 5A establishments that handle, let's say, chicken, they can process under one of the exemptions USDA provides. The exemption allows them to sell in various capacities. So for the vast majority of the exemptions that people operate under in New York State, it does allow them to process their poultry and sell to HRI, hotels, restaurants, and institutions in New York State. So those birds that are processed in a 5A facility can be distributed throughout New York State. They cannot cross state lines. So what that means for the 5A processor is that they can sell their products. In this case, and we verified this, and Tom's on the phone, on the call, just to make sure, but under HRI, institutions do cover schools. So as long, thank you. So as long as the school is okay, and it's from our perspective, it's considered an approved source if you get poultry from an Article 5A, state 5A establishment. When it comes to red meat, as I said, it's not something that we handle. In terms of state 20C operators that are, let's say, a retail butcher shop, so they're going to receive meat from USDA inspected facilities. As Tom said, it's either going to come in with the stamp on the carcass, or the product itself is going to have the federal inspection information, what plant it was produced at. So it's coming in from an approved source into that state butcher shop. When the butcher shop takes possession of it, they traditionally sell it to retail customers. So those are retail transactions. There was a mention about the 25% retail exemption. That is not something the state oversees. That's a federal exemption, which allows that meat market to sell 25% of their meat to HRI. So that is something it's better that USDA or Tom touches upon, because we don't regulate it, but there is that option and avenue for a state meat market that handles inspected red meat to be able to further distribute it. As far as 5A is concerned, any other animal that comes into a 5A establishment that is not considered amenable, so in this case, rabbit, captive raised deer, bison, water buffalo, antelope, those are considered what we commonly refer to them as exotic species, meaning they do not require federal inspection to be slaughtered and processed. They can go through a state facility, and they can also be distributed when they come from an approved source, in this case 5A. That product can also be offered for sale, and in this case to a school.
Does anyone have any questions based on the document or anything that we shared?
I know that Cheryl had a question. Do you just want to ask it out loud?
Sure. I was going to put it in chat. Hi, Corey. It's good to put a face to a voice. You've helped me in the past.
Hey, Cheryl.
Hi. So we had gotten the list some time ago of the 5A facilities, and I thought they had to have a small business enterprise exemption, and I don't even necessarily know what that means. Do they need to have that to sell to HRI, or is it any 5A?
So any 5A that's handling chicken, or what we say amenable poultry, meaning it would otherwise require USDA inspection, they can operate. There's at least 4 exemptions that I know of. There's the producer grower, 20,000 bird limit. There's the small enterprise, which you're referring to. And there's also the retail exemption, which in this case would be our live bird markets. Technically speaking, those facilities can sell to in-state HRI. So it's not just that one exemption, it's actually the 3. And the one that I know of that somebody might be operating in the state is called the producer grower other person. So essentially that's somebody who has a 5A license. They're receiving what we consider amenable poultry, meaning they would require USDA inspection. But the producer, grower, other person identifies them as a business that does not raise all of their poultry. And per USDA law and exemption, they cannot sell to a school. They can sell to hotels, restaurants, and certain institutions, but they cannot sell to schools. So long-winded, sorry, what it means is most of the places, if not all of them, that operate in the state and handle amenable poultry can sell to an HRI. So I think it would be easier to identify the ones that cannot versus the ones that can.
Great, that's actually really helpful. And I believe you shared a list with us via Emily Cook, one of your Ag and Markets colleagues, that lists all the ones that can sell to HRIs. So
Yeah, that's correct. What we did was
Perfect.
we just
Okay.
pulled out the exemptions that cannot sell. So that list are all the current establishments that are operating under an exemption that could sell to HRI.
wonderful. Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I don't necessarily understand all this, but I appreciate a list. It's very clear.
That's okay.
Neither do I, Cheryl. You're in good company.
All right, do we have any other questions about food safety before we bounce over to Amy? All right, hearing none, I'm going to pull up Amy's slides now.
Alrighty.
There we go. And just let me know when I should advance to the next slide.
Okay, that sounds good. Hi, everybody. As Becky alluded to, my name is Amy Barkley. I'm the livestock specialist with Cornell Cooperative Extension Southwest New York Dairy Livestock and Field Crops Program. My job is essentially to help farmers farm and to make the connections with university research and bring it to the farm level, and also share information with fine folks such as yourselves who may be buying these animal proteins and want to know more about how to do it. Next slide. All right, so I was gonna say this slide has the wrong title on it. I did use this image for a beef on dairy presentation. We were talking to some folks who are raising alternative beef breeds, but the lesson's the same. And the overarching concept is that we want farmers to produce quality products, and we want to be able to provide them at an affordable price. And so we're working with producers to optimize their efficiencies while also offering options to folks that may fit their needs, things such as grass-fed, things such as grain finished, pastured pork. These are all different things that we work with in the scheme of livestock management. Next slide. All right, next slide. All right, so I have about 30 minutes slated here. So if you have questions as we go along, feel free to pop them into the chat box so that you don't forget them. And we can go over them at the end of the session is what we're looking at. So this afternoon, I'm going to overview the buying of bulk livestock. I'm going to cover pork and beef, the timelines of raising those animals from the farmer's perspective so that you get an appreciation of what they're working with when you call them, you say, hey, I want beef, and they say, hey, it'll be a year, you know why they're saying that. We're going to talk about developing relationships with the farmers that you choose to work with, and then we'll get into some cuts, customization, and yield from our different livestock species. Next slide. So before we begin, I want to just take 5 seconds, and I want you to think of one question that you'd like answered this afternoon. It can be big, it can be small, but I'm just going to take 5 paces, think about that, write it down, and we'll make sure we can answer that. Next slide, please. There are some myths about purchasing bulk meat that I want to alleviate today. The first is that it's hard to find farmers who sell it. Spoiler alert, it's actually not hard at all. It might be hard to find USDA processing, but generally finding a farmer and then seeing if they might be able to process that animal USDA, I think there's a lot of options out there. The second is it's expensive. As we've already heard before, buying beef or pork in bulk is the cheapest way to purchase it if you're purchasing it directly from a farmer. And the last theory, the last myth is that you can't choose what cuts you get. There's actually a lot of customization that can happen, including taking an animal, buying like a whole animal and having the processor process it all into ground beef. That's totally an option. You miss out on some steaks, but I mean, for school service, that might make sense for you. We can also grind whole animal, or we can also take whole animals and cut them into stew beef. So we'll talk a little bit about typical cut sheets, what those are, and then how you can alter that. Next slide. Some of the reasons to buy in bulk. When farmers are looking to sell their meat, typically they're going to either sell in bulk or they're going to sell individual cuts. If they're selling individual cuts, they have to get it processed with the USDA processor. It's just how the regulations work. With bulk beef, halves, wholes, quarters, boxes, they can process it either custom or USDA. And that's, again, where we want to make sure that you're purchasing from somebody who's sending their animal to a USDA processor, where they have then that opportunity to sell that meat to you legally in that final transaction. When you're buying beef in bulk, you know where it's coming from, whether that be you want to purchase from a certain farm with certain values, whether you want to purchase a certain type of meat that you can't get in the store, or you want to purchase meat that's raised in a certain way. You will understand how the meat was produced, grain or grass finished. Typically are our two options. There's some pasture finishing for pork, but that's not super common. And again, we'll be able to foster relationships between you guys and the local farming community. Next slide. There are a couple of different ways to find farmers. Word of mouth is generally a good place to start. So talk around to other staff in your building. Say, hey, do you buy bulk meat? Do you buy meat from a farm? Where do you buy it from? Do you like that product? Do you like working with that farmer? And getting that information can give you a head start. A lot of farmers also advertise on social media, especially Facebook. There are a lot of farmers who are into Instagram now, so you might be able to find some there. Sometimes you're driving down the road and you see a sign that says fresh beef for sale or farm stand, and you can pull off and see if they have any sort of meat available. And if they have individual cuts, that indicates that they're already connected with the USDA processor. You can also find them at farmers markets. And the other place is the local CCE resource pages. So we've got pages like Erie Grown, Chautauqua Grown. I'm from Western New York, so Southwest New York, so I'm biased there, but there are a lot of other counties that have these programs that list farms in a directory, typically by product, and you can go through and select farmers to contact from that list. And then if you're totally out of options and you have no idea where to start, you can also go to meatsuite.com. This is a partnership between Cornell University, NC State, and I believe the business school. And essentially what it is it's a program that it allows farmers to put their profile and their products online only if they're selling bulk meat. And then from there, you can select farmers and start a conversation. Next slide. So, as I've alluded to, any farmer can take their livestock to a USDA facility if they can find openings. When we look at our processing facilities across the state, there are more custom exempt facilities than USDA facilities. This is in part because there's a lot of extra testing and paperwork associated with USDA facilities that some processors are like, no, we'll just process custom, thank you very much. But there are more USDA facilities popping up around Western New York. I know of one that just started up in the Attica area that has been a great partnership with Farm to Schools since their inception. And there are others that are looking to build USDA because they know that there's a huge demand for that. Because there are a few facilities, the typical lead time for farmers is anywhere from a month. So if they have a contract with the facility and they know they're getting animals in, it could be a month out, or it could be a year and a half, or even 2 years out. I haven't seen 2 years since the pandemic. Most of the time it's hanging around that 6 to 12 month time frame. But if you call a farmer today who processes through USDA, they have to have an animal ready to go first. And then second, they have to have an appointment to get that animal processed. That's why it can sometimes take a long time. So if you're working with a farmer, understanding that lead time is probably a good thing to know in advance so that you're not expecting beef in 14 days. It's actually going to be 6 months. All right, next slide. So for the farmer, the timeline to take an animal, a beef animal from calf to finish is anywhere between 14 and 30 months. Those that are finishing their beef cattle on grain or a total mixed ration, like a silage diet and corn and just a whole bunch of high energy feeds, that is usually about 14 months, sometimes 16 months. But once you start into the grass feeding realm of things, that's where things get longer. The animals take longer to finish out. That means to get fat on them, and so that when you process them, they have a good texture and a good flavor. And sometimes that can take 24 to 30 months. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for beef. Your timeline may be better for grain finished animals. Piglets are between 4 and 6 months to finish. 4 months if a farmer gets 8-week-old piglets in and then grows them out the rest of the way. But sometimes these operations are having piglets on the farm and then raising them out that entire 6 months. There are some breeds of pig and some management styles that are longer than that. So they might be 12 months or 18 months. But most of the farms around here are processing their piglets around that 6th month of age mark. That means that when you're calling a farmer for pork, they might need to get a USDA slot before that animal's even born. And so the farmer has to play this game of deciding, okay, how many piglets do I anticipate having? How many processing slots should I get? Will these animals finish in a 6-month timeline, or will they need 7 months? Will they need 5 months? So there's a lot of guesswork that the farmer has to do based on previous experience to get you what you need when you need it. Next slide. The biggest thing is just communicate with any farmer that you choose to work with. You want to, they want to know, and you also want to confirm what you want, when you want it, how you want it. So how you want it cut is especially what I'm referring to here. The price, and if there's delivery associated or not. I'm not sure if schools require delivery or if they can pick up from the farm, but that really should be talked over with the farmer. Sometimes the farmer can deliver livestock processed as a service, in addition to taking it to the facility. But sometimes they don't offer that. So it's good to check into that. The next point here is follow through with your commitment. I know a farmer in particular who's coming to mind who's worked with Farm to School in the past. The farm had a word handshake agreement to purchase a certain amount of beef. Then the school backed out and they were left with a cow that was ground, or it was processed in a way specifically for that school, and the farmer really was stuck with it. They won't work with Farm to School again. So it's really good to follow through on your commitments. Start small if you're not sure that if you'll like a certain product or like working with a certain farmer, and then scale up if you like it. And the last point is to provide feedback. Is the product what you're looking for? Did it meet your expectations? Was it packaged in a way that was useful to you? Did the kids like it? Did the kids eat it? And is there something different that they can do next time? Farmers generally really appreciate feedback. They don't know how the animal's going to look. They have an idea, but they don't know how the animal's totally going to look when you get it. So giving them feedback helps them improve their practices. Next slide. So how do we buy bulk meat? Farmers can sell meat either by live weight. This is not super common. That's on the hoof, also known as. They sell by hot carcass weight, where hot carcass weight is essentially the animal. It's killed, it's got no head, no feet, no guts, and no hide. That's typically where we start our pricing at. Or they could do by the cut weight, and that's the most expensive way to purchase. And we're shying away from that for this presentation, but I want to mention that that's something that farms do. Next slide. So as I said, hot carcass weight is essentially that carcass that is getting prepped to go into the chiller that will then be cut into individual cuts. And the farmer is pricing their price per pound by the hot carcass weight. Typically on top of this price, there's going to be a cut and wrap fee, there's going to be a kill fee, and there's going to be a further processing fee if you want something made that isn't within the typical scheme of cutting. Most of the time, this is anything that's smoked, anything that's seasoned or marinated, if they have a facility like a 20C kitchen that will allow them to do that. Sometimes fine cutting, things like fajita meat or shaved steak, for instance, may incur an additional fee. Typically, hamburger does not, or ground pork does not. It's once you start adding seasonings to that where it starts to get a little pricier per pound. And they will charge per pound for this. Next slide. The farmers will provide what is called a cut sheet. And this may be provided by the farmer or the processor, depends on who you're communicating with to get that meat back. That's something that you'll want to verify with your farmer before you go into a contract agreement with them. And this cut sheet outlines essentially what you'll get out of the animal part piece that you're ordering. So whether that be a whole animal, half animal, quarter animal. And you could typically choose exactly how you want stuff cut and exactly how many items of each that you want, pending it falls within the normal anatomy of that animal. You can only get so many ribs, you can only get so much bacon, for instance. You can get unique orders like all ground, all stew meat, but this will have to be a confirmed conversation ahead of time because most people want the Delmonico ribeyes. They don't want to go into ground or stew meat. So having that conversation ahead of time, again, is critical. Next. These are some cut sheets from a processor in Tennessee. They're really small, but I wanted to bring them up because this is typically what they look like. They might have some different formatting, but generally you're going to start off with the processor will write down the hot carcass weight of that animal, sometimes a live weight so that he can tell the farmer what the live weight of that animal was. And then they have either typically categorizations for products. So how many roasts, how many steaks, how much other meat, how much ground do you want? And if it's ground, you have the option of sometimes putting it into patty form. Same thing with sausages. Sausages can get linked. They can get linked as large links or small links, depending on if the processor has that. Sometimes you can get smoked things like bratwurst. Sometimes you can't. But generally, this is how those sheets are outlined, just so that you're aware. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the take-home meat from hot carcass weight in a moment. Just know that when a farmer says, okay, you have a 400-pound half side of beef, you're not going to get 400 pounds of meat out of that. You're going to get a fraction of that back because there's deboning that happens. There is trimming of fat that happens. And so we just want to make sure that you understand that if you're paying, let's say $4 a pound for ground beef, you're probably in reality paying closer to $6.50 a pound or so once that animal is said and done, just because of that loss. But in addition to that original payment of fee per pound, sometimes you'll pay a killing or rendering fee. Sometimes the farmer includes that in their price per pound and they eat that cost. Cut and wrap is generally an addition to the price per pound that the farmer is charging. I don't know if they will charge less if you're ordering like 10-pound packages of ground beef versus 1-pound packages. That might result in a cheaper price per pound for cut and wrap. I don't know though. That's something you'll have to ask about. You might have to pay fees for patties, links, smoking, or other seasoned meats. Next slide. I don't have time to go through this whole thing, but I wanted to put it up here for your reference. The big takeaways that I want to share are A, there are only a certain amount of cuts that you can get from each part of the animal. B, there are different cuts that have different textures based on what they do on the animal. So things like legs that work really hard, we typically see them put into ground because that tenderizes the meat just by the function of slicing it into little bitty bits. If we look for things like stew meat, again, we'll typically take them out of those muscles that work a lot because we're braising that meat. We're cooking it for a long time to make it tender. If you go with something like meat from the back portion of the cow, so an area where your steaks are typically cut from, that area of the animal doesn't do a lot of work. So that stew meat may cook differently than stew meat from maybe the bottom of the cow or the legs of the cow, just because it needs less time to cook if there is less cartilage and sinew and collagen and things in that meat tissue. Next slide. Okay, so I think, Becky, that this is like a push through. So if you could just do that, yeah, thank you. So let's talk about expectations. So from live weight, you'll get between 60 and 63% of a beef carcass's hot carcass weight from that live animal. Okay. If that animal is selected for dry aging, which I don't think it would in this case, you will lose an additional amount of moisture. So additional weight loss. Next. So in the end, you can expect to take home between 38 and 42% of the live weight, or a little over half of the hot carcass weight. So that's why I said, like, you start with a $4 per pound hanging weight, you'll end up paying $6 a pound in the final stages for that ground beef. So if you choose to do any bone-in items, you'll typically get more back than if you do bone out. Next. Okay. So let's do this on a real animal. So let's pretend this beef steer was 1,100 pounds live weight, and its hot carcass weight it yielded 61%. So that's about 671 pounds of beef and a hot carcass. If you bone out everything to take home, you'll get 38% of that live weight, or about 418 pounds from that whole animal. And if you do bone in, so you leave some steaks, just say, or some roasts with the bone in, you'll take home 473 pounds. This is just a typical list of what you'll get from an animal if you take it to a processor and say, process this animal for me, without any specifications. Ground beef is typically your largest portion of meat that you'll get back, because it's easy to throw the weird bits and bobs into the grinder and get them ground. And by weird, I mean things that just don't form into nice 4-pound roasts or that sort of thing. So that's just for your perusal later. Okay, so when we look at pork, we're gonna look at something similar. Hot carcass weight, pigs yield a little bit more. So their hot carcass weight is going to be about 10% more at about 72% of their live weight. And so as a consumer, you can expect to take home around 50% with, 3% on either side of that live weight. So a little over 75% of that hot carcass weight. And again, bone in is greater than bone out in terms of volume you'll get back. All right. So if we have a 225-pound pig, and we assume a 72% hot carcass weight yield, we'll have 162 pounds of hot carcass weight for that whole animal. And then if we bone out, so just say we make it all into sausage or all into ground or all into stewing pork, you'll take home about 106 pounds of that, or 47% of the live weight. And bone in a little bit more, about 15 pounds more. Next slide. And this is the same thing that we showed for the beef animal. If you don't tell a processor what to do with your animal, this is what you're going to get back in terms of meat cuts typically. Again, for your perusal later. All right. So we already beat this to death, where we talked about being able to get what cuts you want out of the animal. You can get specialty things in addition to ground and stew meat, like fajita meat, seasoned ground meat, just say you want seasoned taco meat, seasoned in advance, shaved steak, bacon, that sort of thing. And we talked about the processing fees that are incurred by going ahead and doing those customized things. And this slide is just typical meat yields so that you have it, so you don't have to do the math. So a whole beef is about 475 pounds. A whole pig's about 120. A half is obviously half of that, and a quarter is a quarter of that, or anything else you want, because these animals are processed USDA. So you can ask them for 10 pounds of beef if you want, and you'll be able to get that. All right, and some things like just little tricks and tips to keep in mind. The pound price for hot carcass weight can change based on the animal type. Conventional or traditionally fed animals that are typically fed a corn finishing diet are going to be cheaper than a grass-fed, are cheaper than an organic animal, just because it takes less money to produce. You're keeping that animal, well, the farmer is keeping that animal for less time. It takes them less time to get that animal to market. They can provide that cost savings onto you. There are heritage type animals out there, things like Dexter cattle, things like Cooney pigs that are smaller framed and have less of a meat yield. If that's what you're going for, great, but just keep in mind that you might not get the yield out of those animals that you anticipate if you go with some of those heritage breeds. And finally, beef fed grass are stronger tasting than beef fed grain or corn silage as a finishing feed. It just tastes a little bit gamier, a little bit stronger. Some kids may not like it, some kids may love it, but just something to keep in mind. Next slide. And that's it. So if you have any questions for me, you can either contact Becky and then she can ask me, or you can contact me directly. All right.
I'm gonna ask a question.
Yeah.
So I know that I saw Tyler kind of did something similar at one of the Meet Your Beef or Meet Your Farmer events that you organized. So anybody, I know that I think I saw Heidi on here before, Susan. And do you do those events every year?
So the Meet Your Farmer events are really cool. So I'll just give a background of what they
Okay.
are really quick first. So they are where Cooperative Extension partners with farmers to come in and do a pop-up farmers market and education opportunity. So we essentially have farmers there. You can go in and talk to them. You can purchase from them. You can get a little bit of education for us on bulk meat purchasing. And in terms of when we do that, we try to do 1 or 2 a year, but they're a really high impact event. It's a lot of effort to put them on. So that's why we limit it like that. But yeah, if you're interested in going to something like that, keep connected and we'll let you know.
Yeah, so and this is kind of where I got the idea of doing this because Tyler's presentation was really informative. And one of the things that he talked about was how you kind of get a different section of the cow, right?
Yeah.
Depending on how much you're getting, and that if you wanted to do something like all ground beef, you might be able to work with the processor to get the more expensive parts of that section to get to exclude that and have that given
Right.
to somebody else.
Right. So if you're partnering with somebody who maybe wants, just say you connect with somebody who wants all the steaks and they're willing to pay $10 a pound hanging weight for that animal, that might reduce your cost per pound for that animal for some of the less desirable cuts, like the hindquarters, like the forequarters. Good point.
And what that really drove home for me was that you can talk to the farmer and the processor to work on that kind of thing.
Yes.
To kind of get to where your needs are.
Yeah, and because those animals are being processed USDA, maybe the farmer himself says, hey, I can sell Delmonico ribeyes all day. Let me take all those out for you and I'll decrease your price per pound for ground. Yeah, so definitely an option.
Do we have other questions?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to, I thought it would be important to mention, Amy touched upon value-added and processed foods. When we're talking about 5A establishments, just keep in mind, they're processing everything that leaves their businesses raw. So the 5A license doesn't cover any further processing, cook, smoke, marination. So when you're receiving product, if it's coming specifically or directly from a 5A establishment, you should only be receiving raw product. Anything that was further processed, that would raise a red flag.
I know one question that we received in the registration was about how schools are using local beef. So we do have in Western New York, I think that there have been a lot of schools using local beef because we have a lot available. We have access to processors out here a little bit more than in some other parts of the state. But like Amy mentioned, there are some facilities that are in the works and being built. But so I've worked with schools that we got to kind of customize a little bit on what was getting made. So with CC Erie did a dairy steer program with their 4-H program, and the schools got to choose if they wanted ground beef, stew meat. I think we just did ground and stew meat actually. So ground and stew are obviously two really popular ones. All of the processors out here in Western New York have been able to do patties if you would like patties done. Like Amy said, there is a little bit of an added fee on that. But schools are using all different kinds of cuts, except those really expensive ones. Although there is one school in Long Island that does. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much to our presenters, and I will share out this presentation and the slides with everybody who registered for the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Take care. Thanks, Tom.